My name is Grant Henderson. I am 51 years old, and for 10 years I served as the Senior Operations Director and Chief Compliance Architect at Apex Holdings. In corporate life, there are two kinds of people. There are those who stand on stage wearing crisp tailored suits, tossing around hollow management phrases like synergy and paradigm shift. And there are those who quietly crawl into the engine room every morning to make sure the pipes do not burst under pressure. For a decade, I was the man in the engine room. Nobody applauded when the server architecture remained stable during peak quarterly trading. Nobody sent flowers when I spent weekends reconciling financial ledgers to ensure we complied with Sarbanes-Oxley regulations and internal governance rules. But whenever the corporate infrastructure creaked under the weight of an aggressive merger, everyone knew to bring their paperwork to my desk. They called me the Vault because once a compliance audit passed through my hands, it was completely bulletproof. Then came Bradley Vance. Bradley arrived from a rival consulting firm with a 5-figure wardrobe, a spray-on tan, and a mandate from upper management to streamline operations. He was 44 years old, drove an imported sports car, he parked diagonally across 2 executive bays, and treated every department head like an obstacle standing between him and his end-of-year performance bonus. During his very first week in the building, Bradley made it his personal mission to rearrange the entire corporate structure. He began strutting through the operations floor, waving red pens, slashing long-standing project budgets, and firing off corporate buzzwords like confetti at a trust fund party. He looked at my team not as the foundational bedrock of the firm, but as overhead costs that needed to be trimmed to impress institutional investors. My first real confrontation with Bradley occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning during a preliminary review of our upcoming acquisition of a regional logistics platform valued at $10 million. I sat at the mahogany conference table with a detailed risk assessment folder I had compiled over 6 weeks. Bradley walked in 20 minutes late, holding a lukewarm oat milk latte. Without sitting down, he picked up my file, flipped past 40 pages of regulatory compliance notes, and tossed it back onto the table like a discarded napkin. He chuckled condescendingly and said that operations was just glorified bookkeeping, not rocket science. He looked around the room, expecting the junior staff to join in his laughter, but the room stayed dead silent. I blinked once, set my coffee cup down, and did not say a word. I did not need to raise my voice. I could see from the red ink marks he had scribbled on the summary page that he had completely miscalculated the rollover asset evaluation. He had failed to notice that the target firm had open liability claims and that the filing index lacked federal risk clearance under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as the WARN Act under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101. More importantly, he had failed to notice that I was not taking notes on his feedback because I already knew every line of that contract by heart. Instead of fixing his mistake, Bradley decided to push me out. Over the next 3 weeks, he systematically eroded my authority. He transferred 2 of my best senior analysts to a newly created brand strategy department. He assigned my routine vendor authorization duties to a 24-year-old intern who could barely navigate a basic balance sheet. Then, under the guise of organizational efficiency, he uninvited me from the internal deal calendar. My name vanished from the private equity meeting invites. My access to the vendor clearance portal was quietly reduced to read-only status. When I brought a critical billing discrepancy to accounting, the only response I received was a terse message from a junior manager stating that all operational queries were now handled directly by Bradley's desk. Bradley did not fire me outright. Firing a 10-year veteran with a clean record required severance packages, board justification, and potential exposure to wrongful termination claims under federal labor guidelines. Instead, he chose the coward's route. He attempted to make me completely invisible, hoping I would grow frustrated and resign. What Bradley failed to understand was that invisible employees see everything that happens across the corporate network. While he spent his afternoons taking prospective clients out for 3-hour steak lunches, I sat at my desk and quietly accessed an old system folder buried deep inside our secure server directory. The folder was titled Internal Compliance Controls version 2.1. 4 years earlier, during a massive corporate compliance overhaul, the board had authorized me to author a set of custom security protocols. Embedded inside that architecture was Clause 8.1, a single-point certifier protocol designed under federal copyright protection rules in accordance with Title 17 of the United States Code. Section 106. Clause 8.1 mandated that any corporate transaction exceeding $5 million required an immutable digital validation token held exclusively by the designated lead compliance architect. Without that active token, no merger could legally reach financial closure. The system would allow executives to draft contracts, sign preliminary agreements, and host celebratory press conferences. But when the final wire transfer hit the clearinghouse, the algorithm would freeze the transaction dead in its tracks until the token holder issued digital clearance. Bradley had no idea Clause 8.1 existed in our core software. When he took over operations, he had instructed the IT department to grant him administrator privileges, assuming an executive title automatically gave him master control over our legacy framework. But my token was hardwired into the root server architecture, completely independent of basic user roles or executive titles. On a quiet Friday afternoon, as Bradley marched down the hallway, boasting to his new hires about his brilliant restructuring plan, I opened my administration console. With 3 precise clicks, I activated the validator token status and assigned exclusive certification rights to my personal system identifier. I logged the change in an encrypted audit log file, backed it up to a secure drive, and closed my laptop. The floor creaked beneath Bradley's expensive shoes as he strutted past my glass office door. But I simply took another sip of black coffee and smiled warmly. By the middle of the second month, the culture within the operations division had deteriorated into complete organizational chaos. Bradley had brought in 3 external consultants from his former firm, men who wore matching tailored suits and spoke in loud, theatrical voices about disruptive innovation and corporate synergy. They replaced our structured weekly compliance reviews with mandatory morning stand-up meetings where everyone was forced to share their daily win. Meanwhile, actual operational work ground to a complete halt. Invoices accumulated on unattended desks, vendor contracts were signed without proper legal review, and junior employees were left wandering the halls in a state of perpetual confusion and anxiety. Despite Bradley's deliberate attempts to isolate me, the younger staff quickly realized who actually understood how the company functioned under pressure. Junior analysts would slip into my office during lunch hours, carrying thick budget drafts and asking for off-the-record guidance. One afternoon, a promising young analyst named Audrey Miller walked up to my desk holding a multi-million-dollar vendor agreement. She looked around nervously before whispering that Bradley's lead consultant had ordered her to sign off on a preliminary asset breakdown that contained obvious mathematical errors. I glanced at the sheet, saw that $400,000 in operational liabilities had been conveniently shifted into an unverified contingency column, and returned the paper to the young analyst. I told her calmly that if she signed a fraudulent financial statement, her name would be permanently attached to the audit trail when regulatory inspectors arrived. I advised her that if a manager rushed her to bypass compliance, she should politely insist that the manager put the signature request in writing. Audrey nodded slowly, her eyes wide with realization, and walked back to her workstation. Word spread quickly across the department. Within days, employees from procurement, accounting, and legal compliance were quietly bringing their paperwork to my corner desk before submitting anything to Bradley's team. I did not tell anyone to rebel against management. I did not engage in corporate gossip or speak ill of the new executive team. I simply provided precise factual assessments of their documentation. If a contract lacked proper risk clearance, I pointed out the missing legal clause. If a vendor invoice exceeded policy limits, I highlighted the restriction. My quiet presence became a sanctuary of logic in an office consumed by executive vanity and rash decisions. Meanwhile, Bradley was operating at peak arrogance. He had pinned a giant printed roadmap of the logistics acquisition onto the main corkboard in the executive break room. The graphic featured massive logos, glossy chart overlays, and bold text proclaiming a seamless integration timeline. My name appeared nowhere on the chart. In its place was the prominent logo of Apex Capital, the private equity firm funding the final $10 million equity tranche. Seeing that logo brought a quiet smile to my face. Bradley did not know that I had built the relationship with Apex Capital from scratch 6 years ago. I remembered my first meeting with their senior partner, Julian Pierce, a razor-sharp investor who despised corporate fluff and demanded flawless financial numbers. I had earned Julian's respect by identifying a $700,000 tax oversight in a preliminary audit that 3 separate accounting firms had overlooked. After we closed that deal, Julian had looked me in the eye and told me directly that Apex Capital trusted my compliance numbers, not the promises of smooth-talking executives. While Bradley hosted loud celebratory lunches in the corner conference room, I opened a plain text file on my desktop and began documenting everything. I created a meticulous timeline, cataloging every meeting I had been uninvited from, every project reassigned without formal documentation, and every instance where Bradley's team had instructed junior staff to bypass established compliance protocols. I refrained from using emotional language or expressing personal grievances. I recorded dates, timestamps, file paths, and exact quote transcriptions. I titled the document Operational Contingency Log, Unvalidated Triggers. Directly beneath the title, I typed a single guiding principle. When they lock you out of the conference room, ensure they cannot close the door without your key. The tension reached a boiling point on a dreary Thursday afternoon. Bradley called an all-hands meeting in the main glass boardroom to showcase what he called the new agile workflow model. The entire department gathered around the long table. Bradley stood at the head of the room, clicking through a colorful slide deck that declared traditional compliance checkpoints to be obsolete relics of the past. He openly mocked legacy operating procedures, claiming that over-engineering approvals was the primary reason companies failed to scale. Then, he looked directly at me sitting quietly at the far end of the table. In a voice loud enough to carry through the glass walls into the hallway, Bradley sneered and said that legacy managers who could not adapt to modern speed were welcome to hang back at their desks and handle administrative maintenance tasks. A few of his newly hired consultants chuckled nervously, but the rest of the room remained dead silent. Young staff members stared down at their notebooks, embarrassed by the blatant disrespect. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a verbal defense. I met Bradley's gaze with absolute composure, took a slow sip of honey tea, and nodded once. My calm silence acted like a mirror, reflecting his childish insecurity for everyone in the room to see. Bradley cleared his throat, unsettled by my total lack of reaction, and quickly moved to the next slide. He thought he had publicly humiliated me. He believed he had asserted his dominance and has established total control over the department. What he failed to realize was that, by publicly declaring my role obsolete, he had provided me with the ultimate legal justification to step back and let his mistakes accumulate without intervention. 15 minutes after the all-hands meeting ended, while Bradley was still strutting around the executive suite, taking congratulations from his inner circle, the head accountant, Gavin Ross, stepped out of the conference room. Gavin was a veteran employee who had managed corporate ledgers for nearly 15 years. He looked pale, exhausted, and visibly stressed. He walked over to my desk, holding a printed vendor authorization form tied to the $10 million logistics acquisition. Without meeting my eyes, Gavin placed the paper on my desk and asked if I could give it a quick review before he processed the initial wire transfer. I picked up the document and examined the signature block. The invoice was for a $10 million asset transfer, a transaction well above our mandatory internal threshold. According to company policy established 4 years earlier, any single transaction exceeding 7 figures required dual verification, including explicit digital authorization from the lead compliance architect. On Gavin's printed sheet, the digital validator field was completely blank. In its place, someone had scribbled Bradley's initials in thick blue marker, large and sloppy, like a middle school student trying to forge a parent's signature on a permission slip. I read the paper twice, letting the silence stretch between us. Gavin shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. He knew as well as I did that scribbling initials on a paper printout did not constitute legal clearance in our automated ledger system. The software would allow the entry to sit in a pending state, but it would flag the missing token during the end-of-month reconciliation cycle. I looked up at Gavin, set my pen down, and quietly pushed the invoice back toward him. I told him softly that the document belonged to Bradley's new Agile workflow lane, and that I no longer possessed authorization to sign off on executive fast-track items. Gavin blinked, caught the icy clarity in my tone, and slowly retrieved the paper. He nodded once, murmured an apology, and walked back toward the executive suite. As soon as Gavin left, I opened my private tracking log and recorded the event. I typed, Vendor Invoice 44B. Value $10 million. Processed without digital token clearance. Manual override attempted via executive initials by Bradley Vance at 11:37 in the morning. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. I considered sending an automated alert to the internal audit mailbox, which would have triggered an immediate compliance review. But I refrained. Bradley had spent 2 months insisting that I was invisible and unneeded. I decided to grant him his wish entirely. I would let him walk down the path he had carved, completely unaware of the digital barrier waiting at the finish line. The following week, Bradley intensified his efforts to force my resignation. He initiated a formal performance review process against me, sending a sterile email notification, copied to Human Resources. The email contained a bulleted list of vague, subjective complaints. It alleged that I appeared disengaged from corporate realignment goals, showed reluctance to embrace new operational structures, and provided limited constructive feedback during team synchronization meetings. It was a classic corporate paper trail designed to lay the groundwork for a forced departure without paying severance. I read the Human Resources notification 3 times. I did not get angry, nor did I draft a defensive reply detailing my decade of flawless service. I simply saved the email to my encrypted archive drive and added a new entry to my timeline log. Performance review initiated by executive management. Vague engagement metrics cited, 0 operational deficiencies identified. Then I minimized the window and checked my back-end compliance dashboard. The system log showed that the $10 million transaction had been sitting in an uncleared state for 72 hours. The automated ledger had already attempted to reconcile the transaction 4 separate times, and each attempt had failed due to the absence of my validator token. On Friday morning, while the rain rattled against the high-rise windows, I received a direct email from Julian Pierce, the senior private equity partner at Apex Capital. The subject line read simply, System Status Inquiry. Inside the email was a short direct message. Julian wrote that his team was preparing to release the final equity funding for the acquisition, but their internal risk software was pinging an unverified compliance flag on our transaction ledger. He asked if everything was on track from an operational standpoint and noted that my signature was missing from the standard closing documentation. I stared at Julian's email for several minutes. This was the critical moment. I could have called him directly and exposed Bradley's incompetence on the spot, but doing so would have allowed Bradley to claim that I was actively sabotaging the deal out of personal spite. Instead, I adhered strictly to professional protocol and legal accuracy. I drafted a concise 2-paragraph response. I informed Julian that under Internal Controls Clause 8.1, all transactions exceeding $5 million required an active digital certifier token to achieve legal closing. I attached a copy of the official compliance framework memo I had authored 4 years earlier, which clearly stated that attempts to bypass the single-point certifier would result in an immediate transaction hold under federal Sarbanes-Oxley audit standards and would render the agreements void ab initio due to breach of fiduciary duty. I ended the email with 5 simple words. I cannot confirm validation clearance. I hit send. 10 seconds later, an automated read receipt confirmed that Julian had opened the email. 5 minutes after that, my desk phone began to ring. It was an unlisted number from Apex Capital's executive suite. I did not pick up the handset. I let the call go straight to voicemail, packed my leather briefcase, stepped out of my office, and walked down to the main lobby to enjoy a quiet lunch. The trap was sprung. and the digital clock was officially ticking. Monday morning arrived with the dark, heavy energy of an impending storm. The executive floor of Apex Holdings was buzzing with unusual activity. Senior corporate officers, who rarely left their corner suites, were suddenly walking back and forth between the legal department and the main boardroom, carrying thick leather binders and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety and confusion. At 8 o'clock sharp, the final virtual closing conference call for the $10 million logistics acquisition commenced. The call joined executive teams from Apex Holdings, legal representatives from Apex Capital, and senior partners from the target firm. Bradley Vance sat at the head of the main conference table, wearing his finest dark navy suit. He had set up a broad presentation screen, prepared celebratory champagne bottles on a side table, and invited 2 junior analysts to sit in the back to witness his grand triumph. I, of course, was not invited to the call. I sat quietly at my desk 3 floors down, monitoring the back-end server logs on a split-screen display. For the first 15 minutes, Bradley led the call with his customary theatrical swagger. He delivered a booming opening speech, thanking the investment partners for their trust and declaring that the merger represented a monumental leap forward in operational efficiency. He claimed that all internal compliance checks had been successfully completed and that our teams were ready to execute the final wire transfer. But at 8:17, the smooth narrative came to a screeching halt. Jennifer Shu, the senior internal legal counsel for Apex Capital, interrupted Bradley's presentation. Jennifer was a formidable corporate attorney known across the industry for her ruthless attention to regulatory detail. Her voice came through the high-definition speaker system, calm, precise, and completely devoid of warmth. She announced that Apex Capital's legal department had encountered an insurmountable obstruction on the transaction portal. Bradley blinked in surprise, picked up his mic, and asked what kind of minor technical delay she was addressing. Jennifer replied that it was not a technical delay but a structural compliance lock. She shared her screen with all 30 call participants. A bold red warning box flashed across the display. It read, "Transaction status, uncleared. Single-point certifier protocol clause 8.1 invoked. Required digital token holder, Grant Henderson. Token status, unverified clearance denied." The conference room fell into dead silence. Bradley's face flushed bright red. He stammered into the microphone, claiming that the notification was merely an outdated legacy glitch left over from an old administrative system. He assured the investment partners that I was no longer involved in executive operations and that his team had already authorized the transaction using standard administrative overrides. Jennifer Shu's voice turned to ice. She informed the entire board that Bradley's team had indeed attempted to override the system 6 separate times over the previous 48 hours. She projected the back-end security audit log onto the screen, showcasing every single failed override attempt, complete with timestamps and Bradley's user identification tag. Jennifer explicitly stated that attempting to manually override a single-point certifier token without the certifier's digital sign-off constituted a severe violation of federal internal control regulations under Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404. She warned that if Apex Capital released funds under an unvalidated transaction, the entire acquisition contract would be rendered void ab initio under Delaware corporate law, exposing both firms to massive shareholder liability and claims of asset dissipation. At that moment, Julian Pierce, the managing partner of Apex Capital, unmuted his line. His voice was cold and hard as steel. He addressed Bradley directly, asking why he had repeatedly asserted that compliance checks were fully complete when the official system ledger showed an active legal hold. Bradley began to sweat profusely, fumbling through his papers and offering rambling excuses about miscommunication and aggressive timelines. Julian cut him off mid-sentence, stating plainly that Apex Capital would not release a single dollar of the $10 million equity fund until Grant Henderson personally issued digital clearance. 3 floors down, I watched the internal Slack channels explode with frantic messages. Executive assistants were typing, "Where is Grant? Why is his compliance token still active? Didn't Bradley say the legacy protocols were sunsetted? Is the acquisition going to collapse?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, opened my personal tracking file, and logged the exact timestamp of the system halt. I did not make a single phone call, nor did I send an angry email. I simply sat at my desk and allowed the law of unyielding system logic to do its work. At 10 o'clock that morning, my desk phone rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed the private extension of Victoria Thorne, the chairwoman of the board of directors at Apex Holdings. Victoria was a legendary corporate figure who had guided the company through 3 decades of market expansion. She was famous for her zero-tolerance policy regarding executive incompetence and financial negligence. I picked up the receiver on the third ring and greeted her calmly. Victoria did not waste time with pleasantries. She stated that the board was currently facing a catastrophic transaction hold on the $10 million acquisition, and that Apex Capital's legal team refused to proceed without my explicit compliance certification. She asked if I was aware that my digital token was the sole mechanism holding up the entire corporate merger. I replied evenly that I was fully aware of the situation, and that Clause 8.1 had functioned precisely as designed to protect the firm from unvalidated liability transfers. Victoria paused for a moment, letting out a long, measured breath. She acknowledged that executive management had committed a severe operational error by attempting to sideline my department. Then, she asked what it would take for me to step in immediately as an independent lead consultant to resolve the compliance freeze. I did not hesitate. I stated my terms with absolute clarity. I required an immediate independent consulting fee of $25,000 per day, full retroactive reinstatement of my operational authority, and a permanent observer seat on the executive board of directors with full voting rights starting the following quarter. Victoria did not scoff or attempt to negotiate down my rate. She knew that if the logistics acquisition collapsed, Apex Holdings would face tens of millions of dollars in breach of contract lawsuits, shareholder devaluation, and irreparable reputational damage. Within 15 minutes, an emergency board resolution approving my exact terms arrived in my inbox, signed by Victoria Thorne and the entire executive committee. At 10:30, an emergency closed-door session of the board of directors was convened. I was invited to join the high-level video conference. When my camera connected, I saw the entire board seated around the mahogany table, alongside Chief Executive Officer Dwight Thorne. Bradley Vance was sitting in a corner chair, looking pale, disheveled, and completely broken. His boastful demeanor had vanished entirely. Victoria Thorne opened the meeting by addressing Bradley directly. In a cold, decisive voice, she informed him that his unauthorized attempts to override internal compliance controls constituted a gross breach of fiduciary duty, unlawful dissipation of corporate assets, and a violation of company governance policies. She ordered him to vacate his office immediately and hand over his corporate credentials. Bradley attempted to speak, stammering that he was only trying to accelerate corporate growth, but Victoria raised her hand and cut him off completely. She stated that his employment with Apex Holdings was terminated for cause, effective immediately, without severance or stock option vesting. Bradley stood up slowly, picked up his folder, and walked out of the boardroom under the silent, damning stares of the entire executive leadership. Once Bradley had left the room, CEO Dwight Thorne turned to the camera and addressed me directly. He offered a formal apology on behalf of executive management for the reckless disregard shown toward my department's legacy protocols. He formally requested that I exercise my authority under Clause 8.1 to validate the transaction. I opened my secure terminal on my secondary monitor. I reviewed the final asset schedules, verified that the necessary legal addendums protecting our firm from target liabilities had been attached, and entered my master encryption key. With a single press of the Enter key, my validator token executed. The transaction status on the shared screen shifted instantly from a flashing red uncleared warning to a solid green status reading, certified and validated. Within 2 minutes, Apex Capital confirmed receipt of the digital clearance token, and the $10 million acquisition officially closed. That afternoon, the entire operations floor was quiet. The toxic atmosphere of anxiety and confusion that had hung over the department for 2 months had completely dissipated. Junior analysts walked past my corner office, giving me subtle nods of deep respect and relief. I gathered my personal belongings, saved my final tracking log, and shut down my computer terminal. I walked out of the building into the crisp afternoon air, knowing that true authority does not come from loud executive titles or expensive suits. It comes from building foundations so solid that when foolish men try to erase you, the entire building creaks until you return to hold it up.